keep plugging on. So welcome everybody. This is typical of Easter class, if you will. And so people are out and gone and out to breakfast and coming in late and so on and so forth, but that's okay. We are here. Well, just a few comments. In the material that we've been covering on modernism and fundamentalism, the reason for doing that is because that was going to have a very large impact in our culture, but also among, Christianity, if you will, certainly in this country and in other places. And so as we went over that, one thing I wanted to point out is that doesn't cover or resolve all the particulars or things that we're going to talk about, but it was very impactful, and it continues to impact us today. And so that was the reason for doing that. And we'll be pointing back to some of those things. And then also Scott wanted me to point out, as we were talking, that these different, the progressive and fundamental, or not fundamental, but the progressive and the social gospel and things like that were very influential, as we said, because their view was, let's Christianize everything, the government, et cetera, and thus we had, the beginnings of the Social Security and these different safety nets, if you will, that are just fully accepted today, and whether one views that as a real positive or it's gone too far is a completely different question. And so Scott wanted me to point that out to us. And so as we look at this, Carl came in and said, is that heresy? Churches of Christ, make your denomination. Why is that? Because Churches of Christ have always held the position that the claim that we're not a denomination. And however, I think that we've tried to point out and look at that maybe not as much as we proclaim. So we wanted to look at that, in fact, starting off. And so as we look through what happened in the 19th century and begin in the 20th century, one of the big things that was going to happen was what was called the premillennial controversy. And this is a shift that's going on. And so we want to look at some detail. We've touched on this, but we want to look at the context because for a big chunk of the early part of the 20th century, this dominated things in Churches of Christ. And so we want to look at that. Now for us, we look at it, well, what's the big deal? Well, it was a big deal to them. And so we want to look at that because that informs us today. And so I wanted to touch on some definitions that we have looked at before, but just wanted to refresh us because they're very specific now. And that is, what is a sect? And a sect has a very negative connotation generally. But what it is a religious organization that insists that it and it alone constitutes the entirety of the kingdom of God. In other words, we got the truth, we got it right, and you don't. Whatever that's applied to. Typically, a sect stands in judgment of both religious organizations and on the culture in which it exists. In other words, here's the things that are wrong. This is why you're not right. This is why we are. Now, there's a lot of different sects. Okay, and so it's not something unique, but it's an attitude, it's an idea, it's a thought. And as we saw in the 19th century, our fellowship had that view, but then we also saw that there was a lot of others that did. We looked at the Landmark Baptists, for example, last year, and we saw that this attitude of exclusiveness was prominent. Certainly the Mormons were. Now, we wouldn't necessarily consider that Christian, but nonetheless, they were on the frontier and had some of that mindset. Now, what is a denomination? Well, for us, the definition is in our American context. And that's important. That's a little different than European. A church that recognizes it's only part of the universal body of Christ, A denomination typically has made its peace with the dominant culture in which it exists. Well, what does that mean, made its peace? Kind of accepted where it's at and the way things are. And in America, there's a lot of that. Not that there aren't other places either, but it's kind of made a peace. Instead of this kind of separatist view, it's kind of this inclusive kind of view. And so we've often said that we aren't, because we don't have a hierarchy of controlling bureaucracy above us looking down to tell us what to do. Well, that may be an aspect, but that is not the only understanding of what that is. And so the reason we're looking at this is because in the 20th century, we're going to start seeing this shift from that more, us against them, to kind of more blending in with things. So by the end of the 19th century, the Church of Christ had solidified its status as a full-fledged sect. Now, remember what happened at Sand Creek that we talked about. That's where kind of the split between the formal, maybe it wasn't formal, but a significant event of that split between the disciples and what we call our Churches of Christ. And so we were saying, you're not right because of all these things, and we've talked about them extensively. By World War I, the Church of Christ had embarked on its own journey from sect to denomination. Heated disputes over three issues were going to be prominent: premillennialism, institutionalism, and liberalism directed the course throughout most of our 20th century for us. In this chapter, we're going to explore the great controversy over premillennialism that virtually consumed, as I said, our fellowship from around 1915, at least into the 1940s. Now remember, whenever historians or others are looking at these things and giving dates, there's a life before, leading up, and there's a life after. In other words, it just didn't just start then and end then. And so these things are significant. And you've heard us mention before that in our church's documents, in the bylaws, there was a statement that said, no premillennial teaching. We are not very directed, saying O'Fallon was not going to do that. Well, for a lot of us, where does that come from? Well, it came from those that had grown up in this environment where those things were so significant and important to them. And they had reasons for that, but just I always found that interesting. And so let us go over a few terms again that we've gone over, just because this is the context of what we're talking about. What is millennialism? That's the perspective pertaining to that final golden age of human history involving Christ's second coming, largely based on Revelation 20, 1 through 9, which describes the angel casting Satan into the bottomless pit for 1,000 years, thus millennium, and it anticipates a period characterized by peace, justice, and righteousness. So it is this end times understanding that there's going to be something there in the end, whatever that is. Well, there was two major views on that. At first, and certainly here in America, was this idea of post-millennialism. And that, as we said, is the outlook that suggests that human beings will usher in the millennium or final golden age by virtue of human progress. In other words, Christ will come at the end of the 1,000-year reign. This was a dominant view in America. And Campbell held very much of this, and we spent quite a bit of time looking at that. And we could see how, looking at all the things and advances that were going on, at least from some perspectives, that that must be so. And so that is right. In this scenario, Christ's second coming will occur only at the conclusion of the millennium and therefore be post-millennial. Many Christians embrace this perspective following the 18th century Enlightenment, with its emphasis on progress through science and rationality. So again, very dominant view, very positive Honey, everybody's getting better. We just got to educate everybody. So on and so forth. All that was running rampant. And of course, things kind of later happened here in America, like the Civil War and things like that, that kind of helped to alter that perspective, if you will. Now, premillennialism is an outlook that suggests that Christ at his second coming will usher in the new millennium. This is the idea where Christ comes before the 1,000 years to usher it in. Or the final golden age on earth, and will rule with his saints on earth for 1,000 years. In contrast to the postmillennial perspective, the premillennial position emphasizes that God alone is capable of inaugurating the millennial age. Now, we might look at this in our way of thinking where we are today as like, what's the big dust up over these kind of academic views? Well, it was really big then. And there's reasons, and we're going to go over what that was. Now, as we said in our kind of preparatory material, premillennialism then gets really detailed. And they don't even agree among themselves among all the particular things, and we kind of touched on that, and those of you that have read that have some familiarity. And I've never got a grasp of certainly a lot of the particulars on it because it's just too confusing to me. But what people attach on is look at the headlines. Look at the headlines. Look, it says here that these, and so that kind of draws them in. And of course, Scott's class on Daniel was kind of the antithesis of that understanding. And so that was very good, I think, for that, certainly in light of this. So you mean we sometimes pick and choose the parts we want to focus on and don't pay attention to some of the others that might modify that? Funny how that happens as human beings. Well, and again, this is what's gonna bring a lot of the conflict, and you'll make a lot of sense here. So, what is apocalyptic worldview? Now, we talked a whole lot about that before. Stone had that, and so on and so forth. So it was very different than the way Campbell did. Lipscomb was steeped in this. Harding and others, as we're going to see. But it is the outlook whereby the believer gives his or her allegiance to the kingdom of God, not the kingdoms of this world, and lives as if the final rule of the kingdom were present here and now. In other words, it's here now. I'm living in it now. I'm following Christ now. I'm not getting tangled up in all these things that are in the world, and you not only shouldn't, but if you're living a Christ-like life, you won't. And so people had very strong opinions on that. Such a perspective inevitably generates a lifestyle that embraces a critique of one's culture and society. In other words, they're saying, here's the problems with it. And so this is what guided many of the churches of Christ, because remember, we said that when that split came, your Christian churches on a whole, remember, it's never simple, were more kind of to the north and had a greater economic situation than in the south, where you're poor and things like that. And so those things affect perspectives. And so those that tended to be more so from the lower economic strata tended to think more this way. Now, whether that was because they were in the South, I'm not saying people couldn't be rich and think this way, but nonetheless, it's kind of an overall look. Ken, did you have something? Oh. Economic, regional, sectional understanding. You know, I mean, we do that now. We say the left coast, right? And right? Well, that's a political statement because we think that's where all the crazy stuff comes from, right? Right? Left and the right coast. And so we view the sensible flyover country. So that's a negative view on people that live here. And so we all have those. And they affect how we look at things. Sure. I think that's exactly right. So I wanted to touch on this because this is what we're digging in deeply to, and that general over-understanding. Now, during the waning years of the 19th century and the early years of the 20th, no one within the Churches of Christ embraced premillennial eschatology, that means these end times way of looking at things, with more fervor than James A. Harding, as in Harding University. Okay, now he didn't start Harding University, but they named it for him. Co-founder with Lipscomb and the first president of the Nashville Bible School, which became Lipscomb College and Lipscomb University as it is now. But in many ways, premillennialism was not Harding's principal concern. His formal eschatology, end times way of thinking and looking at things, reflected a deeper worldview that pervaded and sustained his theology at every significant point. Simply put, the worldview consisted of his conviction that he belonged to the kingdom of God rather than any institution or kingdom reflecting human contrivance and ingenuity. Okay, so I'm part of the kingdom. And all these other things, and they may be a better form or a worser form, but that's the kingdom of the world. And so we really shouldn't embrace that. And thus, what are things that characterize us? What are you doing voting? How can you run for office? You can't do those things because you're part of the kingdom, not part of the world. And so why are you entangling yourselves in that is what it was some of the thinking of that. And it was very, not complete, but it was very strong, certainly in the South, and those areas of influence that have been down there. Now, this conviction created in Harding a level of trust in God that awed and baffled many of his contemporaries. R.C. Bell, one of his students at the Nashville Bible School, later wrote that Brother Harding possessed more fully than any other Christian I've known Paul's absolute confidence and unqualified trust in God's promise to supply every need. Harding refused to rely on salaries, contracts, or other measures that might have guaranteed financial security and gave away much, perhaps most of his material wealth that came his way. He was convinced, as he put it, that God would supply all his needs. Now, as we sit here in America in the 21st century, as generally middle-class people, that's really scary. We wouldn't do that. I would be a burden to somebody else, and things like that. Meaning to the degree that he went, and he truly believed that. He didn't have more than probably $300, $400, $500 from what I've read to his name. And again, you're talking money back in those days. Pardon? Well, but still that. Correct, but still not that much. He had a horse and a buggy. I don't know that he even owned a house, but he relied on that and he viewed that. Remember, we had people like Benjamin Franklin, not who I'm talking about, the preacher, and others that held, and even Warren Barton Stone held that they thought being poor was a virtue. And so some of that kind of went over into the preachers of keeping the preachers in poverty so they stay honest. As far as what people paid later on. Well, I understand that. Yeah, when they certainly start getting the jet planes and all that they need to fly around in, and if you don't, God won't, whatever. You're right. But nonetheless, and so. There was others that thought this way. I don't know that everybody thought that way, but nonetheless, and it had a strong impact. Oh. Sure, but are you willing? But are you willing to give up your other stuff to prove that point to yourself? Right. I'm just saying. Yeah. Are you giving up your sewing machine? No. Well, right. And so these things. Now, I'm not saying that's right or wrong, and very much so. But most of us would say, I'm not there yet. Might be a better way of saying it. So in many ways, Harding represented the epitome of the apocalyptic tradition that flourished in the Mid-South for 100 years. He refused to place faith in human institutions, human schemes, or human progress, as they labeled those. So he was not a postmillennialist. He had no faith, whereas Campbell had tremendous faith in all these advances that were going on and scientific things and so on and so forth. So two very different perspectives. Now, I'm here saying that doesn't mean this is right and this is wrong, and it doesn't have to be defined in terms of right or wrong, but it's two very different perspectives. Instead of not only trusting that God would triumph over the earth in the last days, but also God would take care of his children in the here and now, removing any need to rely on human accomplishments. Perhaps more than any other person in this tradition, Harding made it clear that premillennial eschatology was merely a facet, an expression of a worldview defined chiefly by faith in the overarching providence and kingdom of God. And so in a sense, here's this worldview and way I got. That aspect's part of it, but that's not the whole shindig, or understanding, if you will. Now, why is this going to be important? Because later in the 20th century, there's going to be those that, in viewing this, when it comes into the church. And what was happening in premillennial thinking, and that's why we looked at the fundamentalism, because that was influential. Doesn't mean everybody thought to all the degree of what. But in that thinking, it comes across as the church was a mistake. And so for those in our fellowship that look at that and we go, no way. And so that was a big part of that, and the drawing of lines. And so those that thought like this, and so that's what's going to happen as we go along. Harding's worldview affected his views on several key issues in our tradition. For one thing, it undergirded his opposition to missionary societies. Now, we've always heard about that. Missionary societies, instrumental music. That was the big reason, and they certainly were parts. But why is that? He maintained that loyalty to missionary societies reflected trust in human schemes and institutions rather than in the kingdom and providence of God. In other words, you're thinking you need help, that God's way is not sufficient in their way of thinking, and therefore you make these, you're putting your hope in something else than God as to his way of looking at it. Every missionary society on earth is built on disbelief, he stated, when the National Bible School that had served for many years finally moved in the late 19th century to incorporate under a board of trustees in order to ensure the property would always be used for the purposes of which the institution was founded, Harding strongly objected. And so here he is teaching at the school and everything, and now they're having to update it to society norms, if you want to state it that way, or ways of doing it. And we would understand doing that as, well, yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's what happened in Zambia with the ministries we support there with David, that things weren't whatever, and so the locals were going to take all that property, and so then they had to form a whole new thing and then incorporate it in whatever ways to prevent that from happening again. And so, we see a more contemporary context. But anyhow, so because of him, that was just too significant. And so he left, and he formed Potter's College, I think, up in Bowling Green, Kentucky, just a little north of there. And that lasted for a little while. I think we'll touch on that at some point. But anyhow, so this was a big deal to him. I could not work as a teacher of the doctrine of Christ under such control. He wrote, in doing the work of Christ, a Christian should not submit himself to be directed and controlled by any other authority than that of Christ, nor should he belong to any other institution for the advancement of the Lord's cause than the Church of God. And so this was deeply, deeply held conviction that he had. What are you thinking there, Ken? Oh, totally. That what some call that extreme autonomy. Some have phrased it that way. And so, oh yes, very, very much so. And, cooperating on food pantry. Some of that fits into this kind of thinking that some of our congregations still hold and have told us so. Well, you mean Nietes. Well, sure. I think that's a direct... Now, what you find out, and this is true of everybody and everything, in my opinion, everybody's not near as consistent as they like to think so on the application of whatever understandings. And so there's picking and choosing that goes on. But no, that's exactly right. Part of it, because those congregations supporting that aren't right on, in my view, this, and this, so I can't have anything to do with them, because then that would be affirming what they're saying is how the thinking goes. And in the views of many, that kind of thinking has not been good. In the views of many, thinking that way, and has kept things from happening. I'm not saying right or wrong. I'm just saying that plays into that. So anyhow, but now, deeply held, deeply sincere beliefs in what he's holding here. 100%. 100%. Yeah, it could be. And then, of course, who was it that was, supporting these good works? As my mom always used to say, a poor man never gave somebody else a job where they could afford them, pay a salary or whatever. And so, those who have more economic wealth among us have often been supporters of many good things, whereas most of us can't support like that. And yeah, and so, it gets complicated. It's not so simplistic, in my view. In addition, Harding, like Tolbert Fanning and Benjamin Franklin and many others before him, strongly warned against located preachers who relied on regular salaries for their support. Harding maintained that such preachers rebuffed the promise and providence of God. He idealized both the itinerant preacher and the system of mutual edification. And this was going to be part of that institutionalization and so on, controversies that are going to rage. This is a big part of that, and so we'll be talking even more in detail. Whereby a variety of resident males in a given congregation took up the leadership of all aspects of worship service, including preaching. And so there were preachers, but they weren't located here. receiving salary. When they would come, they give love offerings or however you want to call them. But and so it's your turn to preach, Ron. And so and Carl. Well, and so the idea was behind that is that we should all be growing in our spirituality instead of relying on somebody to do this, so we don't have to do. And there is truth in that. There is value in that. However, there are others, as we're going to see, saw it not that way, and we're going to see that there's truth and value in that too. And so there's always going to be these different views, and it's not necessarily, does it have to be this is right and this is wrong, or maybe this is how we're doing it. And because to these people over here from all these influence, this makes more sense. To those over here, it makes sense to them. And so, and those are the kind of things that have often caused this rapid division and telling everybody the wrong and things like that. And there's problems with that. This has been the practice of the Church of Christ for most of the 19th century, the mutual edification. And we should recall was a model for which Tolbert Fanning argued so strenuously in the aftermath of the Jesse Ferguson affair. Now, if you recall, that happened in Nashville, and he was an up-and-coming young guy and powerful and charismatic and all this, and then he kind of went over to the spiritualists that was going on in the 19th century, the seances, you can draw the spirits up and things like that. He kind of got a lot more into that, and it kind of caused a big blow up in the Nashville church. Well, don't think that isn't affecting how Tolbert Fanning is viewing these things, because he's seeing all this problems, destruction, pain, whatever you want to call it, that's happening here. And so nonetheless, and so his view is that's because he's this paid, located preacher. Now remember, Tolbert Fanning started Franklin College. Franklin's just a little south of Nashville. And Lipscomb was there. Lipscomb was his protege. And so he was big in education. His wife could speak like 4 or 5 languages. His wife led singing in the congregation. Just different. It's very interesting looking at that. But nonetheless, so here's a highly educated guy, and so he's for training in, the college trained in the scriptures, but he was not for the located preacher. And so, it's not just a trained schooling kind of thing. Well, he was an elder, and he would preach. I could see how we would look at that and say, that doesn't seem as consistent as your position, but nonetheless, he saw it as that. And again, we all pick the things that we focus on that help us to determine what we think about something. And so he's doing that. But yeah, some would have those questions. No, I get it. Yeah. We say so, and supposedly, but in reality, some may question that. Sure. Yes. So some have the 20th century CEO model, and that these guys run the show and do all that, and that, that's not necessarily what it says. But how did that understanding come about? Well, because in our culture, we've seen these things, and they're making stuff happen, and like, hey, I kind of see connections, and maybe, and then so they're busy bossing each other around and saying, I'm the boss and you're not, and those kind, and that kind of stuff has created all kinds of problems in places. Sure. No, correct. Mhm, mhm. Just may happen because that's who they are. No, 100%. Right. Well, this is all true. But then, what did Jesus say? Jesus said, in the world they lord it over them, but not so with you. He said you're to be a servant of all. It talks about love. It talks about forgiveness. It talks about extending grace. Often those things are pushed aside when there's conflicts going on and people pick and choose what they want to focus on and forgetting that I'm supposed to do that. And that's happened much and to many. Sure. And yet we think, well, and we justify and explain and all this, and that's why it's important that, as I say, take a breath and think this out and so on and so forth. And again, that's a human condition. That's not unique. When a Texas preacher asserted in 1883, now you're going to see in Tennessee is way different than Texas. And if you don't believe that, just ask somebody from Texas. When a Texas preacher asserted in 1883 that the brethren in Texas know that the churches that pay their preachers best will always have the best preachers, Harding was stunned. He knew, he said, that the more and more men were preaching for hire, but I was not prepared to find that even one of them would boldly in public prints approve of such a course. And so, well, I mean, this is very instructive on many levels. First of all, Harding's surrounded by those that think like him, and then he's exposed to this, and he's just in shock and disbelief. Well, he needed to be aware and to get out there, so to speak. And you also see that in Texas, they're going to be of a more pragmatic nature, being out on the frontier. And so we're going to see that pragmatism influences how they interpret that. And so this is going to be a real difference that develops. And it is precisely in this context that one finds an early major shift among the Church of Christ toward institutional and denominational status. In 1910, a full-blown written debate on this issue erupted between Harding and L.S. White, the Texas preacher, who preached for the Pearl and Bryant congregation in Dallas. There can be little doubt that both the larger shift and debate were at least to some degree regionally and economically inspired. While the shift toward the pastor system occurred chiefly among people of greater means, it also occurred mostly west of Nashville and especially in Texas. And so some of this is, now in Texas, you have TCU. That's a big disciples university. And there was others. And it was all kind of there, but when that split came, those of the disciples held on for somehow to not only the church buildings, but also to the universities. And so when that happened, Churches of Christ were meeting in storefronts and shacks and things like that because they got, and we kind of mentioned some of that before. And so that's why it took a long time till, the fact of our schools becoming universities, that's only happened in the last 20 years. They were colleges, and something lesser before that. Takes time. In the Christian churches, when they had their split from the disciples, Ozark Bible College, Johnson Bible College, and so the Christian church, Lincoln, which I think closed there in Illinois, those Christian church schools were in the same kind of pattern, way behind, even where we had progressed because of that time factor in development. And that's just a little side note. And so anyhow, we will. You mean the Christian church and disciples? Well, it was all one. And so it's when those that thought this way left, and those, I don't know all the exact particulars, but it seemed to work out that way. And so the disciples ended up being the more wealthy congregations, ended up buying into what we would later term liberalism. They of the Restoration movement are the more liberal theologically, and we're more conservative. And the Christian churches said, hey, they're both wacky. They're too far this way, they're far that, and the Christian churches view themselves as middle of the road. And so just to simplify it some. We will stop here. And so thank you for that, and we will continue on next week. I hope this was interesting, because I think it's going to explain a lot and help us understand who we are and where we are today.